welcome Ambassador Singh today to this conversation on how the world is going to change post-COVID. We are not yet post-COVID though, and I think a lot of post-COVID is emerging, and everybody's hoping that it's soon post-COVID era. But as things are progressing. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us today. My name is Deepshikha and I represent Speakin. Thank you very much for taking this opportunity, sir, to join in. You've had such an illustrious career, right from being the former Indian ambassador to the United States, France, and Israel. You're also, sir, distinguished fellow at Emory University and the visiting faculty at Ashoka University. Today, sir, we will be talking about India's relation with other countries, COVID, particularly in the context of the recent developments we've seen with respect to China, the US changing demographies, Pakistan, and of course the business and economic implications of that, sir. I'll just take a moment, sir, to very briefly talk about your journey as you've moved, and had an extensive experience around the globe, including your distinguished 37-year career in the Indian Foreign Services. You've served during the pivotal periods in key global capitals and were instrumental in shaping India's policies, most notably continuing the progress in the India-US relationships. Also, the closer ties to Israel and formulation and implementation of India's policies with respect to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran in the period which followed 9/11. So another period that requires expertise from legends like yourself, sir, as we start the conversation today. That's the introduction, sir, and may I please welcome the opening remarks from you.
Thank you, Deepshikha. And I think we're having our conversation at a critical time. You already see a lot of analysis and commentary suggesting that the COVID and its impact is going to be a pivotal moment in international relations. In economic terms, many have said that its impact is as severe, if not more severe, than that of the Great Depression in the 1920s. In terms of economic contraction that is happening all around the world. And also people are pointing out that trends in international relations, the changes in balance of power, all that are either getting accentuated or accelerated as a result of COVID. So I wanted to briefly capture in the conversation, what are some of the major trends emerging, different from what we had seen or anticipated so far. First of all, relates to China. And clearly, since its reforms in 1979, China has emerged as a major political, economic, and military power. Today's China's GDP is 2/3 of the US GDP, 5 times India's GDP. It is a strong military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. But the manner in which China responded to the COVID initially has raised issues about the nature of governance in China, because there was a lack of transparency in the process through which they shared information about how the infection was spreading, what kind of precautions the other countries should take. And that was a result of the kind of governance system they have, the Communist Party-led governance system. And while certainly countries are entitled to have their own internal governance system, but if that governance system impacts on other countries, then other countries have a legitimate right to ask questions. And in this case, because China has globalized, because economically China has integrated with the rest of the world, what happened in China had a tremendous impact all over the world. And therefore, those questions are being asked about governance in China, as China becomes a more integral part politically and economically of the global system. Later, of course, China responded well in terms of containing the infections and stepping forward to help other countries who were going through the crisis at a later stage, sending assistance, sending doctors, sending equipment. But then they were criticized because many of them were found to be faulty and of poor quality. In several countries, they pressurized host governments who were receiving assistance from China to come out with statements in support of China and praising China. And that again had a negative impact in several of these countries, particularly in Europe. Many have described that China is now resorting to what is called wolf warrior diplomacy, that diplomats have been given a mandate to be aggressive, to go out there, to push the Chinese narrative. And in France, for example, the Chinese ambassador put out a message that in France, the doctors and nurses were abandoning patients in nursing homes and running away. And for a local ambassador to do that kind of thing is highly unusual. And the French foreign minister in fact, summoned the Chinese ambassador to protest that. So there have been both positive and negative reactions to the manner in which China has dealt with COVID and subsequently. The second country where the impact would have major global repercussion is the United States. Normally, when you have a crisis of this nature, since the Second World War, and especially after 1990, it is the United States that has been in the lead in bringing together global cooperation. They did that when we had the SARS epidemic in 2002-03, when Ebola threat came, and several other instances. But in this case, because President Trump has followed the practice of America first, and he has decried global cooperation. So when the pandemic happened, the United States did not organize any global effort for cooperation and just focus on dealing with the challenge within the United States itself. So as a result, at the global level, essentially, it became every country for itself, rather than an organized global response to the challenge. Also within the United States, for President Trump, who has met with tremendous opposition internally, even before the COVID infection came, and even before the present protests that are happening in the United States, one of his major achievements was the economic growth rate in the US and low levels of unemployment. So till about January, historically, US was having extremely low levels of unemployment, below 4%. So he was very keen to project that the United States was doing very well economically. And therefore, he just wanted to wish away the pandemic, that it is not there. We are doing very well, and that we will come out of it very soon. And therefore, the United States lost a lot of time before it organized a response to the pandemic. And as a result, we see large number of infections, more than 2 million infections within the United States, a large number of people who have unfortunately died. And eventually they had to do kind of a lockdown, shut down economic activity. And unemployment went up to almost 20%. And people are projecting that this year the US economy will contract by 6 to 7%. So as a result, the US, its leadership role in the global context has taken a major hit. It is not seen as a country that other countries would go to work out coordinated response. The soft power of the United States has taken a hit, and the US economy has taken a hit. Therefore, how US emerges after the COVID impact and the manner in which it defines its role internationally remains a question mark. And the third area where there's been major impact has been Europe, because so far the entire European project was based on free movement of people, free movement of goods, the European Union as a single entity, the Schengen visa regime, the euro as a common currency for more than 18 countries. So with that, it was expected that Europe as a whole would respond in a united manner to the crisis. And that did not happen. When the infection hit Italy initially, France and Germany banned the supply of medical equipment to Italy. Then the movement of people was stopped. Movement of some critical medical supplies was stopped. So the question was asked as to the entire European project, which is based on free movement of people and goods and solidarity with each other, is that coming under challenge? Now, European leaders have tried to respond to that later, because now they've come out with a common 500 billion euro bond that will be managed by the European Commission and raise resources to share partly as grants and partly as loans with countries heavily impacted by the crisis. Now, this is a major thing because even after the 2008 financial crisis, this kind of measure Europe was not able to take. So clearly, they've seen the threat to themselves and they're trying to respond. But we have to see how European countries come out of this crisis, what happens to the European project, and that will certainly have a global impact. Another major impact, and I think that will have consequences also for us, is that the whole issue of supply chains is being questioned. As things had evolved since 1990, when the US had worked to integrate China in the global mainstream, there had been a globalization of supply chains, and China had become a very integral component of this supply chain. Today, there is a sense that this overdependence on China is a threat to security of other countries. And especially they found that when they needed some medical supplies, medical equipment, it was not immediately forthcoming, that the quality of the medical equipment also was not of the level that they wanted. So now questions are being asked whether the whole earlier philosophy of pushing for production across the world at wherever is cheapest should be questioned. And instead, first you look at onshoring production at your own country, and if not, the base production in countries that are reliable partners or countries that are not too far from you, from whom you can ensure a reliable supply chain. So I think going ahead, the whole issue of supply chains is going to change. And the US, which had earlier pushed for globalization of production, is now pushing for onshoring and for more restricted and more secure supply chains. And I think from India's perspective, this reworking of supply chains will create certainly opportunity. And if you have seen the Prime Minister in his recent comments has spoken about a self-reliant India and basing our recovery on the basis of Atmanirbharta. But then combining that with India becoming an important part of supply chains based on self-confidence and a self-reliant economy. Because in today's context, if you're looking for technology, if you're looking for financial resources to supplement whatever else we are generating internally, supply chains become important. And it is as a result of that that India has also shown that despite the challenges it is facing itself, it has worked for global cooperation in the present context. It had led in organizing a meeting of SAARC countries. It pledged a certain amount for support to other SAARC countries. India has supplied medicines in the context of COVID to more than 100 countries, and including to faraway countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And again, you can see the impact in terms of supply chains that before the COVID crisis, India was not a major manufacturer of PPE, the personal protective equipment. And today it has become the second largest manufacturer in the world of PPE after China. So again, a shifting in terms of production and supply chains is certainly happening. So I would say that the world after COVID is going to be very different from the world that we saw before. China will try and use this opportunity to assert that it has managed the crisis better, its form of governance is better, and that people should look at building more trade and economic relationships with China. In the United States, much will depend on what happens in the elections in November. If President Trump is re-elected, then we can expect that the policy of America first and diluting commitment to allies, particularly in Europe, all that will continue. And therefore, the leadership role of America could come under challenge. And America could look at not globalized production, not building enhanced trade and supply chain-based relationship, but doing more production in America and then in its neighborhood. And third, we have to see how does Europe emerge from this crisis? Because according to European leaders, both Russia and China have been spreading, campaign in Europe, making the argument that European countries have not shown solidarity, have not responded well to the crisis, and that countries in Europe now need to relate to the rest of the world more on the basis of nationalist considerations. So in whichever way all this emerges will have a tremendous impact on economic linkages, on manufacturing and other opportunities. And I think for India, given our strengths, we will probably find opportunity, particularly in digital technology, because as we have seen in the context of COVID, so much is happening digitally. In fact, even our conversation is taking place virtually. So more and more work is being forced to be done digitally, and technology is enabling that. So digital technology will play an even bigger role in our lives. And that's an area where India has some strength. And that's so that will certainly develop, and I think India can look for partnerships there with countries in Europe, with the United States and others. And the second area where we have some strength and there will be more opportunity would be in the pharmaceutical sector. Because again, after COVID, there's going to be enhanced focus on healthcare, not just this virus related, but other dimensions. And the pharmaceutical sector will come under more emphasis. And I think India has shown strength in generics, in vaccines, and that will give us opportunity going ahead. So these are some of the changes that are in play, and the manner in which we all respond, including India, will determine the future of economic and trade linkages. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, sir, for setting the context for us. So, so I think as you rightly pointed out, you know, the Wolf diplomacy that you talked about and the Chinese narrative, and I mean, I think the entire America First narrative, and I think there's a lot of firsts emerging. I mean, India also talked about being Atmanirbhar, and everybody's kind of trying to secure their borders, secure their people, and therefore the nationalistic fervor is emerging globally. But what is happening, sir? Because, you know, we're talking about the Chinese narrative, Chinese trying to build that narrative that I am emerging. And if Trump comes back, then there'll be an automatic, you know, that the void in the global leadership. So do you think with the negative narrative that Chinese has, the entire situation has built, irrespective of what Chinese can talks or doesn't talk, is that working? Will that work? Will they emerge as the preferred leader? Because, you know, the world economy moves by the dollar, right? So will they be welcomed? Will they face resistance? If yes, then who's going to be taking that spot, or that spot is going to be empty for a while now?
Although, as we discussed, President Trump has spoken of an America First policy. And although he has said that the US commitment to its allies, especially in Europe, US is spending too much, the allies are not spending enough. But at the same time, the Trump administration has given enhanced attention on the Asia Pacific. More than any other administration, this administration has taken on the Chinese challenge much more. And for example, on trade, they have taken much more action, tariffs and other action against imports from China. So I think they have absorbed for now that, that China is a peer competitor economically and in terms of civilian technology. In military terms, China still lags behind the United States, and it is Russia which is a peer competitor for the United States. But in terms of civilian technology, digital technology, China has emerged as a peer competitor. For example, in 5G, Huawei is seen as having world-class technology. So there is a tremendous pushback from the United States on China. So even if he gets re-elected, the effort to continue to build partnerships in the Asia-Pacific region with Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, other countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, that will continue. And I think the US effort would be that in this region, countries should not be in a position that they see themselves as having as no other choice except an engagement with China. And again, countries in the region itself, and there many of them articulated this point. Recently, there was an article in Foreign Affairs by the Prime Minister of Singapore, where he was making the point that countries in the region would like to have an option, and option of dealing with both United States and with China. And therefore, from the US perspective, what they're trying to do is push back technologically in terms of the gains that China has made, which they believe unfairly, by forcing technology transfer from American companies, by subsidizing products, by their state-owned enterprises not quite working on the same terms as private companies do. And therefore, recently, the US president has passed an order that Chinese companies who want to list on US stock exchange have to be much more transparent in terms of their ownership and other aspects. And it is felt that it will make it difficult for Chinese companies to list now on the US stock exchange. They have taken measures to restrict Chinese acquisitions and investment in the US. So that effort is continuing. So I think what will happen, whether it's President Trump or President Biden, the effort to meet the challenge from China will continue. How other countries react, I think countries in Europe, countries in ASEAN, they would not want to be in a position to be forced to take sides because they would want to benefit from the trade and technology linkages, and they don't see a strategic threat necessarily from China. So that will be something in play, and it's a bit uncertain how that will work itself out.
So I would, you talked about the digital supremacy that we could bring in. You also talked about, us being in pharmaceutical and some of the other areas where Indians could come forward and start delivering. Would we again end up being the back office of the world? Because right now there is a clear possibility. I mean, do you think the government today is still too busy on Rajasthan, Bihar, and Bengal, rather than using this opportunity to establish a global narrative? I mean, we've seen the Australian Prime Minister make samosas and eat samosas, but is there more that the government can do to come out and take a more visible position in the entire global frame of reference?
So I would say that from the various statements that have come out from the government, the finance minister, the prime minister, it is clear that there is a recognition of the challenge that the economy is facing. And I think effort is being made to arrest the negative trends, and through enhanced credit and direct government expenditure, once again kickstart the economy. And I think as part of the process, I think pharmaceuticals and digital technology will get emphasis aside from infrastructure. And in terms of digital, I didn't say digital supremacy, but strength in the digital technology sector. And therefore that gives us a basis to build partnerships. For instance, interestingly, a large part of our trade with the US is in services trade. And it's a broadly balanced relationship in services. If you look at trade in goods, our trade with the US is a very small part, or at very low levels compared to the US trade with other countries. With China, it's several times the trade with India. But if you look at services sector, the US-India trade in services is broadly the same level as the US trade in services with other countries, and several notches higher than the US trade in services with China. Therefore, in services sector, we have strengths and in digital technology, and we need to build on that going ahead.
You also talked, sir, about being Atmanirbhar, but China, irrespective of what we say about Chinese narrative or forcing their way by buying in technology and subsidizing that you talked about, but it's a very, very long drawn story. I mean, it has taken time to build. I mean, and you also talked about, sir, about the supply chain pressure, how the organizations are now being forced to be more local. Because of course the global supply chains are under pressure, but it's not going to happen overnight. The businesses which are going to fuel that supply chain, the last mile delivery and build up of those products, are under pressure immensely as far as Indian systems are concerned. Liquidity is drawing up further and further as we move forward. How will India be able to support its demand, even if it kind of consumerism or the sentiments improve, how long will this impact be? Because right now it seems like a good 2 to 3 year drawn up economic battle.
You're right. So supply chain changes will take little time. As we discussed, there have been several comments from leaders all over the world about changing the nature of present supply chains. At the same time, you may have seen that Volkswagen has just announced that they're going to do an additional $2 billion investment in China, in the electric mobility sector, because that's where they see business opportunity. There was a survey done by an American company in Germany, and they found in the survey that more than 37% of Germans felt that the relationship with the United States was more important than the relationship with China. But 36% of Germans felt that the relationship with China was more important than the relationship with the United States, because for them, trade and economic aspect was important. Another survey in Japan, the representative of Toyota said that they're going to continue to invest in China, so long as China remains a major market. So one has to factor in that so long as the Chinese market offers opportunities, countries and companies will remain engaged. But there is going to be balancing happening in terms of new investments, in terms of building more security for supply chains. And that's where there will be opportunity also for India. Now, so far, we have obviously not been able to fully capture that opportunity, because in terms of some shifting of supply chains that happened over the past year or so, people have found that a large number went to the US, some went to Vietnam, and a very small number came to India. And similarly, we have to see that with the new rebalancing, how many more companies look at the opportunity in India. Several have spoken of that. And for that, again, a lot of things come into play in terms of import taxes, other levies, availability of infrastructure, the sort of ease of getting various clearances. So different dimensions are looked at, because when a company has many opportunities to invest in different countries, it balances out the cost and benefit. But as one can see clearly, the intent in India is to also attract this investment, because it will supplement the resources that we are putting in internally. It will also give us access to a wider global market, and it's all bring in fresh infusion of technology. So that would be important. But of course, one can't rely just on external sources. Certain amount of the internal effort, including in terms of policies, consistency of policies, infrastructure, all that becomes important.
So another question, which is kind of leading up to this, and we've had a lot of conversations, the Indians stranded abroad and Indians globally. What do you see as the changes will be in the immigration and the migration space post once everything settles in and the borders open for Indians?
Yes. And you're right. I think that could be another area where it will have an impact on us. For instance, remittances into India have been of the order of almost $60 billion annually. Large number of remittances coming from the Gulf and other countries. Now, Gulf economies have also taken a hit. Oil prices have come down. I mean, they've been fluctuating, but essentially they've come down. As a result, projects in Gulf will be stalled. Many people will lose jobs, and therefore many will come back. So that can certainly have an impact on remittances. Again, you're seeing reports that because the US economy has been very negatively impacted, levels of unemployment have gone up, that the US president is talking about restricting H-1B and L visas. And that will again certainly have an impact on India, because bulk of H-1B and L visas have been used by Indians and Indian companies. So with restricted availability of flights, and we don't know when the present crisis is going to end, because there are people talk of second waves, and therefore, and again, countries don't want to start flights with other countries where infection rates are still going up, or numbers of infected are going up. So when all this will normalize, it's very difficult to say. And so if it's going to take months or even more, because the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, for example, has said that he does not see the economies bouncing back till 2021 or 2022. So if that is going to happen, then certainly movement of people, international migration, immigration, remittances, all that is going to take a hit.
So what do you think, sir, is going to happen, particularly from the other parts of the world? So right now, every narrative or every, from a PR perspective, media perspective, everybody's talking between US, China, and since we are in India, what is happening to the rest of the world? What's happening in, say, South America or parts of Africa? Because Africa was supposed to be one of the more interesting areas of investment as well, where a lot of people are looking towards. What is happening in those areas? Where are they headed?
So everywhere, the challenge is everywhere. If you look at Brazil, for example, and its population is 1/4 or less of India's population, and infection levels are higher than in India. And so there has been large number of people infected. In Latin American countries, others also facing similar problem. If you look at our very important partner, Russia, again, a very large number of people who've been infected there. Similarly in Africa. So there have been some countries who have been, New Zealand Prime Minister, for example, has said this, New Zealand is COVID-free now. So there have been some countries that have managed to curtail the impact. In South Korea, initially, they were able to reduce the caseload, but now then there was talk of a second wave. But I think everywhere, the infection did spread, and people, each country is trying to deal with it in its own way. They've had different variants of the lockdown. They've had different variants of social distancing. But again, I think there's a recognition that despite all this, you also need to get the economy going. And again, in many places, the people themselves have just refused to take restrictions anymore. We look at United States. People are just stepping out and going to beaches, going to restaurants and bars for psychological and other reasons. They just don't want to take the restrictions anymore.
Absolutely. So, sir, I'll just I have a couple of my final questions before we move to the questions by audiences. One big question, sir, is in terms of and I would like to take you a more speculative or a guesstimate on what's to come in a crystal ball kind of a scenario. We've seen the news of unrest coming in, the mental challenges, and it's kind of globally. Today we heard of major unrest in Paris, and then there was some inflation about Israel being talked about, some anti-Israel comments were passed, etc., etc. The US has been burning for a while now. Where do you see this internal sentiment headed? I mean, where do you see the entire humanitarian exchanges between countries and the whole sentiment emerging or re-emerging from this entire scenario?
Well, in the US, the present protests have, of course, been triggered by what was seen as a racist action by the police against African American. And that led to a huge response, because as many in the US themselves has acknowledged, US has been facing this challenge for 400 years. Well, there's a very deep undercurrent of racism in US society, and African Americans face deprivation, inequality, prejudice in day-to-day life. And so there are moments when it sort of bursts and comes out in the open, and that is a manifestation that is going on. And then this problem of racism is not just in the US, it's also in many other parts of the world, including in Europe. And therefore, people of African origin in France have also come out in solidarity with what's happening in the United States, but also because they have felt similar challenges in their own day-to-day lives. Now, many would argue that at a time when you have an economic crisis and large numbers of unemployed, the frustration levels certainly go up, and it sort of adds to the sense of deprivation and exacerbates the response to any crisis. But clearly, I think issues related to race have played a role. And again, many have argued that the current president of the US has not played a very positive role in trying to calm down tensions within the US, and that he feels that by dividing society, it may be helpful to him electorally, and he has opted for that policy. So if the economic situation continues on its negative trend, and with more and more people feeling financial pressures, not able to work, we will probably find different manifestations in response to crisis situations coming out in the open.
So I'll have a last question, sir, before we move on to taking questions from the audiences. Should Indians overseas be worried? Because this is in some sense strengthening the narrative, right? Strengthening the black and white divide, not just from a US perspective, globally, black, brown, and white. So will this strengthen that narrative, and should Indians abroad be worried, or those looking to migrate abroad be worried about this whole transition in the thought process? Or is this always there and it's okay?
So I don't think they should be worried. Of course, they must all take precaution in whichever areas or localities they live in. Because this undercurrent has been there all the time, and it takes on a severe manifestation from time to time. This is not the first time that protests against race have happened in the US. Many, of course, have argued that the manifestation this time is more severe, but it has happened before. So that is always there. So I don't think they need to be worried as such, and that all societies have some form of discrimination. And you have to deal with the challenges you're facing, and then look at being integrated in whichever society you are, and being a positive contributor to the society in which you are, that where you feel comfortable on a personal basis in terms of the economic and other opportunity. And in terms of new opportunities, the next year will be a challenge, because large number of Indians, for example, go to study in universities. Now, we don't know whether universities will open for the fall semester or not, or whether they will do that virtually. And if travel is uncertain, if flights are not regular, will they be able to go to join universities? Again, if flights are not regular, how do you go on any kind of visa, be it a H-1B or L visa? Embassies are not processing visas. So I think at least for a year, as things normalize, all this will slow down. But I think once the world comes out of the COVID phase, things will get back to some extent to where they were, with changes. Because even with modification, production and technology has globalized. And therefore, there will be movement of people because where technology develops through interaction. Of course, we have to see how does new technology, digital technology, enable interaction even from a distance, and if that changes things. Now, because a lot of work that was being done on the spot, if it can be done remotely, then maybe you don't need to migrate. You can do it remotely from where you are. If you can work from home in the US, then you could do the same job being in India for a US company. So maybe there can be much more of remote working. And so we have to see. We have to see how these trends play out.
Great, sir. Thank you very much. That's all for my questions. I'll now move to the audience questions. There's a question coming in. What are your thoughts, sir, on the Nepal controversy? Is it a passing issue, or would it snowball into a larger issue involving US and China?
So, of course, that is not related to COVID. And I wanted to keep the discussion on the impact of COVID. But, I think if you look at how India has managed its relationships, India has tried to look, India's policy is to look for a multipolar world. And so that there is strategic space for India to take decisions in its own interests, and does not want the global situation to be dominated by one country or the other. So it hedges its options. And I think we are finding the same in the case of Nepal, that as Nepal sees more options, with an enhanced Chinese presence globally in the Asia-Pacific region, in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, it is also hedging its options. And so clearly, because of the growing presence of China in our neighborhood, there will be more challenges for us. And on the specific issue of the border, I think, as you may have seen, the spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs has come out with a statement outlining India's position that this is Indian territory. But I think we have to factor in that with an enhanced Chinese presence in our neighborhood, with enhanced Chinese economic and technological capacity, all our neighbors will be hedging more, and that will increase the challenges for India. Just the other day, for instance, there was a consultation mechanism established and a meeting held between the Chinese Communist Party and representatives of political parties in Sri Lanka to discuss the Belt and Road Initiative. So you can see, as their footprint is expanding, their interaction with other countries, including in our neighborhood at different levels, is increasing. It's inevitable. And we'll have to prepare ourselves for that and work to respond to that. And the best way to deal with that would be to enhance our own economic capability. It is only when India's economic capability is enhanced further and India's economic linkages with countries in our neighborhood are enhanced further, that they will see more opportunity in the interactions with India, and that we will be able then to balance out the growing Chinese presence in a more effective way.
Perfect, sir. So I have another question coming in from Facebook Live as we are there. Harish Anand asks, how far US will be able to contain China?
We'll have to see. We'll have to see. And I think the US itself says that their policy is not to contain China as such, because containment was easier for the US in the context of the Soviet Union. Because Soviet Union was a military rival and a peer competitor of the US, but the Soviet economy was not interlinked with the US economy. And therefore, it was possible for the West to try and contain and push back on the Soviet Union. With China, the situation is very different. The Chinese economy is heavily interlinked with the US, European, Western, and global economy. For example, China holds more than $1 trillion worth of US securities. China is among the largest trading partners of the US, with the total trade being of the order of $500 billion. So with that, I think the US policy is not so much containment, because economic linkage will remain. And other countries don't, including Europe in ASEAN, don't want to give up on the China option. Plus, the pushback with the Soviet Union had also been on the basis of ideology, that it is a communist ideology, and the US spoke about a democratic capitalist ideology, and the two systems couldn't match. And that was used to push back. And also countries in Europe, Western Europe, saw a threat to themselves from the Soviet Union and therefore worked. Now with China, if you look at other countries, Singapore, Vietnam, even countries in Europe now, Hungary, Poland, their models of governance are not necessarily very different from what is described as the authoritarian model in China. Therefore, they don't see the same kind of an ideological divide with China that Western Europe has seen with the Soviet Union. And therefore, they are not so comfortable with anything that could be described as a policy of containment. So I think the US effort is to slow down China's technological rise, where it has emerged as a competitor for the US, deny China access to American technologies like it had in the past. For example, the US has now said that Huawei cannot provide 5G in the US. And it has also said that any of its allies, and if they take 5G technology from Huawei, then US would have to reduce technological partnership with those countries. So there's a pushback in the UK, there's a pushback in Australia. They have now come out with a regulation that
not just US company, but any product licensed by a US company cannot be supplied to Huawei. So that is the kind of pushback that is happening. A Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company has just been encouraged to put up a $12 billion semiconductor plant in the United States. So that again, to deal with the Chinese technological challenge. So what I see much more, not so much as containment, but an effort for the US to get the technological edge against China so that US national security interests and economic interests in other parts of the world, including Europe, Asia, are not thwarted by increasing Chinese influence. And I think so that's the kind of strategy they would adopt.
Fantastic. So as we near the end of the conversation, let me take the last question that comes from Alok. And Alok asks, India has been observing globalization and westernization over 3 decades, since the early 90s when things opened up. Do you think self-reliance is possible when Indian consumers themselves prefer imported, cheaper, better quality products?
No, so I think it depends on what you mean by self-reliance. And I think it has been argued that self-reliance is not autarky, that you don't cut yourself out away from the rest of the world. It's a mechanism by which you're not dependent on others. You build up your own capacities, and you have certain strengths as part of a global engagement. And therefore, you build manufacturing capacity, you build technology, and you're part of the supply chain, because that has also been talked about. But as you're part of the supply chain, you have your own technological and manufacturing strengths. So that has to be critical. So I think that is how the argument is also playing out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and sharing with us the different facets of this entire worldly relations as they are changing in the new times. First, of course, the priority is that all health restores soon, and then we cross each border as it comes along. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. Thank you, everyone who has joined us for this conversation on Facebook, on YouTube. And we look forward to hearing more from you, sir, in the near future.
Thank you.